The radio crackled with static that turned to pure panic. General Hasso von Manteuffel stared at the intelligence report, his hands trembling slightly as he read the same words again. An entire tank battalion had punched through the German defensive line near the Siegfried Line, and they were moving deeper into Reich territory than any Allied force should have been able to penetrate. But what made his blood run cold wasn't just the breakthrough itself. It was who was commanding the tanks. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, the unit that High Command had assured him would be held in reserve, away from the most critical sectors of the Western Front. Hitler's face would turn purple when he learned this. Von Manteuffel already knew it. He'd witnessed the Führer's volcanic reactions to far less devastating news. This wasn't just a tactical setback. This was an ideological catastrophe wrapped in military defeat. The regime had spent years promoting the myth of racial superiority, had built entire propaganda machines around the notion that certain people were inherently inferior soldiers. And now that very myth was being shattered in real time by men that Nazi doctrine said should never have been capable of such military excellence. The battalion had arrived in Europe in October 1944, and since then they'd fought through freezing conditions, dense forests, and some of the heaviest German resistance. They'd never been pulled back, never been given rest, and still they kept advancing. Their killed-to-casualty ratio was becoming legendary among the Allies, whispered about in foxholes and officer tents alike. The men of the 761st didn't just fight, they fought with something that German commanders couldn't quantify in their tactical manuals. They fought like soldiers who had everything to prove, because they did. Now, at this critical moment when Hitler was preparing his last major offensive, Operation Unmatched and Vaktum Rhein, the Ardennes counter-offensive that was supposed to turn the entire war around, the Black Panthers had done something that threatened to unravel the entire German strategic vision. They'd created a bulge in the front where no bulge should exist. They'd shown that the German defensive system, the one that was supposed to hold back the American tide, had critical vulnerabilities. And they demonstrated it with a unit that the Nazi regime had desperately hoped would fail. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about this crucial moment in World War II. The winter of 1944 had turned brutal across Europe. Snow fell in thick blankets across the Ardennes forest, and temperatures dropped so low that men froze to death in their foxholes, despite being dressed in winter gear. The Germans were counting on this weather to protect their preparations for the massive counteroffensive they were planning. The thick clouds and snow would keep Allied aircraft grounded, giving German panzers time to reorganize and concentrate their forces. But the Black Panthers, under the command of Colonel Paul L. Bates, had already proven that weather and terrain were merely obstacles, not insurmountable barriers. What made their breakthrough particularly shocking was the method. While other U.S. units were struggling with supply lines stretched thin and commanders debating strategy, the 761st had developed a reputation for aggressive, almost reckless tactics that somehow worked. They moved faster than any unit ahead of them. They fought through situations that other commanders would have called for reinforcements or retreat. And most importantly, they refused to accept the defensive stance that so many other units had adopted during this grinding winter campaign. The battalion soldiers knew exactly what they represented. Many of them had faced discrimination their entire lives, had been told they weren't good enough, that their race made them inferior warriors. The U.S. Army itself had been segregated, with black soldiers often relegated to supply and support roles rather than combat positions. But the 761st had fought their way into combat through sheer determination and excellence, and once they had the opportunity to prove themselves in battle, they became a force that neither German high command nor anyone else had anticipated. Von Manteuffel understood the broader implications immediately. This wasn't just about one battalion's tactical success. It was about the fundamental narrative that held the Nazi regime together, the narrative of racial hierarchy, of natural German superiority. The Black Panthers' breakthrough created a contradiction that couldn't be explained away by propaganda. These men, according to Nazi ideology, should have been incapable of executing a sophisticated armored breakthrough. They should have lacked the racial characteristics necessary for such military excellence. And yet, here they were, tearing through German defensive positions with precision and devastating effectiveness. The general knew he had mere hours to contain the situation before Hitler learned the details, and he knew with absolute certainty that when the Führer did learn them, his response would be catastrophic. Not just militarily, but psychologically. Hitler's entire worldview was about to collide with a military reality he had no framework for understanding. The briefing room fell silent when Colonel Bates' name was mentioned. Not everyone in the room knew exactly who the 761st was or what they represented, but the senior commanders did. They understood the implications of a black unit breaking through German lines precisely when the Wehrmacht needed to maintain a solid defensive posture. In the Reich Chancellery, meanwhile, the news was being processed through an entirely different lens, one filtered through ideology, propaganda, and the desperate need to maintain control of a narrative that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Hitler's initial reaction wasn't quite volcanic. The witnesses noted he seemed unusually quiet when told that a colored unit had achieved what no white American unit had managed to. The silence lasted longer than his typical reactions to bad news. Then came the questions, how is this possible? What had gone wrong with the defensive preparations? Why hadn't German commanders anticipated this breakthrough? The queries came rapid fire, each one more accusatory than the last. But underneath all these surface questions was something deeper, a fundamental crisis of ideology meeting military reality. The Black Panthers' breakthrough had happened in a sector where German High Command had specifically concentrated their forces, believing this would be sufficient to stop any American advance. They'd moved 3 panzer divisions into position and had prepared defensive fortifications that were supposed to be nearly impenetrable. Yet the 761st hadn't just broken through. They'd done it with fewer losses than German commanders considered statistically possible for a unit of their size. The mathematics of warfare didn't work the way Hitler's racial ideology thought they should. Throughout Germany's high command, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Younger officers began quietly discussing what they were seeing. How could the racial theories that had justified the entire German racial state be correct if men of African descent were proving to be superior soldiers in actual combat? How could the regime maintain its ideological coherence if the bedrock assumption that certain races were naturally more capable of military excellence was being shattered on a weekly basis by increasing evidence to the contrary? The answer, of course, was that it couldn't. The only way to maintain ideological purity was to deny the evidence, to mischaracterize the data, to find ways to explain away what was happening in the field as anomalies or statistical flukes. But increasingly, that became impossible. Unit after unit of American forces, including the Black Panthers, continued to advance. German defensive positions continued to crumble, and the comfortable narrative that had justified so much suffering and evil was being dismantled by the simple fact of superior military performance by men that the Nazi regime had desperately hoped would fail. The propaganda ministry struggled with what to do with this information. They certainly couldn't acknowledge the Black Panthers' success in official publications. That would undermine the entire carefully constructed argument about racial hierarchies. But they also couldn't completely suppress the news because too many people, including soldiers at the front, were already aware of the breakthrough. The solution was a kind of strategic silence. The event would be acknowledged in the most minimal terms possible, stripped of any racial context, and immediately recontextualized as part of a larger German strategic maneuver that was supposedly progressing according to plan. But Hitler knew the truth, even as official reports minimized the breakthrough.
The Fuhrer understood what was really happening. A unit of black soldiers was proving more effective than the racial science he had built an entire regime around said they should be capable of. It was a contradiction that couldn't be resolved through dialectical arguments or propaganda. It could only be denied, suppressed, and ultimately destroyed through overwhelming force.
The strategic implications were equally devastating. If the Black Panthers could break through the Siegfried Line and continue advancing at this pace, the timeline for the entire German defensive strategy would collapse. The Ardennes Offensive, which was supposed to turn the war around by driving a wedge between American and British forces, would become impossible if American units were penetrating German territory faster than expected. The careful calculations that German High Command had constructed for their final offensive suddenly seemed much less reliable. General von Montoul found himself in an impossible position. He was responsible for this sector of the front, and technically the breakthrough on his watch was his responsibility. But he also understood something that not everyone in Hitler's circles seemed to grasp. The Black Panthers had broken through because they were better soldiers than the units they'd replaced, not because of any deficiency in German planning or preparation. They were better because they had something to prove, because they trained harder and longer than most other American units, and because their commanders had understood how to deploy them effectively. The question that haunted von Montoul, and increasingly haunted other German commanders as well, was what happened to an ideological system when reality refused to cooperate with theory. The answer, slowly and painfully, was that the system began to crack from within. Each piece of evidence that contradicted the foundational racism of the Nazi state created another fracture. And the Black Panthers, simply by being excellent soldiers, were creating those fractures faster than any propaganda machine could repair them. Colonel Paul L. Bates stood in the freezing cold, watching his men move through the snow with a precision that belied the brutal conditions surrounding them. The 761st Tank Battalion had been in continuous combat for over 2 months now, and they should have been exhausted. They should have been requesting rest, resupply, and rotation out of the front lines. Instead, they were pushing deeper into German territory, past the Siegfried Line, past the defensive positions that German High Command had assured would hold back any American advance. The men of the 761st knew exactly why they were pushing so hard. For decades, black soldiers in the American military had been relegated to support roles, had been told they weren't combat ready, had been excluded from the units that got credit for victories. The 761st had fought for their opportunity to serve as tankers, but trained relentlessly and had finally gotten their chance in combat. They'd proven themselves again and again, but the deeper truth was that they were fighting not just for military victory, but for something more, fundamental. The right to be recognized as full soldiers, as complete members of the American military establishment. Sergeant Warren Creasy was one of the men under Bates's command, a tank driver who'd become something of a legend among the 761st for his ability to navigate through the most difficult terrain and keep moving when other drivers had given up. Kreis had grown up in the segregated South, had experienced racism his entire life, and had learned early on that success would require him to be twice as good as his white counterparts. That lesson was now being applied in the frozen forests of Europe, and it was working. The tank crew worked as a unit that had bonded through months of combat. They knew each other's reactions, could anticipate movements, could fight their way through situations that would have broken less cohesive units. They were experiencing something that the psychological warfare divisions of the German military had calculated would never happen. They were becoming better soldiers through the very discrimination that was supposed to have held them back. The injustice of their situation had forged them into something harder, faster, and more effective than the propaganda said they should be. Intelligence reports coming back to German High Command noted in their sparse official language that the American Colored Unit was performing at levels that exceeded expectations. Exceeding expectations is what German military bureaucrats called it when they wanted to document something that fundamentally challenged their worldview, without explicitly confronting it. The reports came in with increasing frequency. The 761st had captured this position. The 761st had advanced past that landmark. The 761st was now deeper into German territory than any American unit had previously penetrated during this phase of the offensive.
The tactical brilliance of the breakthrough was partly due to Bates's command decisions, but it was also partly due to something more fundamental: desperation mixed with determination. The 761st knew they wouldn't get the same credit for their achievements as white units would receive. They knew that their success would likely be downplayed, their sacrifices minimized, their contributions overlooked. So they fought with a kind of aggressive precision that left no room for doubt about their capabilities. They couldn't afford to let anyone question their worth. The German defenders they faced were increasingly confused by the tactics they were encountering. American tank formations typically followed certain established patterns that German commanders had learned to anticipate. But the 761st, operating under Bates's command, used different approaches. They were faster in their maneuvering, more aggressive in their combined arms tactics, and seemingly willing to take risks that other American units avoided. From the German perspective, this appeared to be either recklessness or a level of military innovation that they hadn't encountered before. What was actually happening was something more complex. The 761st had trained extensively before entering combat, had studied tank warfare tactics intensively, and had developed their own doctrinal approaches based on their particular circumstances. They couldn't always count on air support or artillery the way other American units could. They often found themselves in situations where they had to be self-sufficient. This had forced them to develop a style of warfare that was more flexible and adaptive than the standardized approaches used by most American units. The psychological impact on the German soldiers they faced was equally significant. Racial propaganda had been embedded in German military culture. Since the rise of the Nazi regime, soldiers had been taught that certain races were naturally inferior in combat, that genetic factors made some groups inherently better warriors than others. And now, on the frozen front lines of the Ardennes, they were discovering that the men they were fighting against, the ones who were supposed to be racially inferior, were systematically outfighting them. It created a kind of cognitive dissonance that no amount of official recontextualization could fully repair. Tanks from the 761st broke through multiple defensive lines that had been specifically prepared to stop exactly this kind of penetration. German defenders who'd been told these positions were nearly impenetrable found themselves overwhelmed by the speed and precision of the American attack. German commanders who'd planned for a methodical American advance found themselves dealing with a situation where American forces were moving faster than anticipated. The entire calculus of German defensive strategy was being disrupted by a single battalion of black tankers whose very existence was supposed to contradict everything Nazi ideology had built thought. In the upper echelons of Nazi leadership, the contradiction between ideology and reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The racial science that had justified the entire German state, that had been the philosophical foundation for the most horrific policies and atrocities, was encountering a problem. The empirical evidence was not cooperating with the theory. The 761st Tank Battalion was providing that evidence in the form of military victories, strategic breakthroughs, and tactical innovations that refused to fit within the established ideological framework. Hitler's response when pressed for details about what was happening in this sector of the front was to demand explanations that didn't invoke racial factors. The official position became that the American unit was being given unfair advantages through superior supply lines, better equipment, or numerical superiority. None of these explanations were accurate, but they had the advantage of allowing the ideological superstructure to remain nominally intact, while reality was systematically dismantling it. The contradiction between ideology and reality had always existed within the Nazi state, but it had been manageable as long as the evidence could be suppressed or recontextualized. The Black Panthers, by their very existence as combat soldiers and by their superior performance in battle, were creating evidence that could not be indefinitely suppressed or easily recontextualized. They were proof that the foundational premises of Nazi racial science were wrong. And that proof was accumulating on the battlefield, in the form of captured territory, destroyed German positions, and strategic advantages that shouldn't have been possible according to the regime's racial theories. General Heinz Guderian, one of the most sophisticated military minds in the German High Command, understood the full implications of what was happening. Guderian had always been more pragmatist than ideologue, and he could see that the performance of the 701st was exposing fundamental flaws in German strategic assumptions. If the racial theories that underpinned military planning were incorrect, then the entire strategic framework needed revision. But within a totalitarian state where ideology was policed by secret police and dissent was fatal, such revisions were impossible. The propaganda response shifted slightly. Instead of claiming the 761st was inferior but over-equipped, propaganda began to downplay their significance entirely. Stories appeared in German newspapers about spectacular German defensive successes in other sectors, about new weapons being deployed, about strategic reversals that were supposedly going according to plan. The Black Panthers' breakthrough was simply erased from the official narrative, treated as if it hadn't happened or was irrelevant to the larger strategic situation. But the soldiers on the front lines knew the truth. They were encountering evidence that their racial ideology was fundamentally wrong, and no amount of propaganda could fully convince them otherwise. When they were facing that evidence directly, the morale impact on German troops who were...
But from a political and ideological perspective, it was an existential threat. The regiment's very existence and success were contradicting the central claims of Nazi ideology. Colonel Bates, commanding from somewhere in the advance, was focused entirely on the military situation. He understood that his men were doing something historically significant, that they were breaking barriers that had existed for generations. But his immediate concern was the tactical situation. Where were the German reserves? How much ammunition did his unit have? Could they continue advancing, or did they need to consolidate their current position? These were the questions that occupied his mind as the 761st pushed deeper into German territory. The men under his command were experiencing something that would reverberate through history. They were not just fighting a military enemy, they were fighting against an entire ideological system that had declared them inferior and was now being proven wrong in the most concrete possible way through military success. Every tank that broke through German lines was breaking through a barrier of racial propaganda. Every position they captured was a demonstration that the theories justifying Nazi racism were fraudulent. The German response came faster than anyone anticipated. Hitler, once apprised of the full extent of the Black Panthers' breakthrough, authorized a strategic redeployment of forces specifically designed to contain and destroy the 761st. This wasn't just a military decision, it was personal and ideological. The Führer couldn't allow this contradiction to continue to exist on his front lines. The unit had to be stopped, isolated, and if possible, destroyed. By early January 1945, the 761st found themselves in a precarious situation. They'd advanced so far and so fast that their supply lines had become dangerously stretched. German forces were beginning to consolidate around them, attempting to encircle the battalion and cut off their retreat. The weather remained brutal. Snow continued to fall in thick blankets. Temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, and the men were beginning to feel the strain of continuous combat without adequate rest or resupply. The situation reached a crisis point when German forces launched a concentrated counterattack aimed specifically at the positions held by the 761st. The Germans committed panzers and mechanized infantry. Units that had been held in reserve for other sectors of the front now concentrated on the objective of destroying the Black Panthers battalion. For the first time since their breakthrough began, the 761st found themselves in a genuinely desperate situation, where their numerical and positional advantages had evaporated, and they were facing the possibility of encirclement and destruction. Casualties began to mount. Men that the battalion had trained with, fought alongside, and bonded with through months of combat started to fall in increasing numbers. The tanks that had carried them through the Siegfried Line were damaged or destroyed. Supply shortages became critical, Ammunition was running low, food was minimal, and the cold was as much of an enemy as the German forces surrounding them. For the first time in the campaign, doubt began to creep into the consciousness of the 761st soldiers. Had they pushed too far? Had their aggressive tactics finally caught up with them? Was this where the American racial experiment in tank warfare would end, not in triumph, but in destruction? The psychological pressure was immense. These men had been told for their entire lives that they were inferior, and now they were facing a situation where they might actually be destroyed, and their destruction might be used as evidence that the racial propaganda had been correct all along. Colonel Bates faced the most difficult decision of the campaign. Should he attempt to break out of the encirclement or consolidate his position and wait for American forces to relieve the battalion? Either option carried enormous risk. A breakout attempt might result in heavy casualties or the loss of men to capture. Consolidating and waiting meant accepting a siege-like situation, where his men were under constant pressure from surrounding German forces with supplies that were running low and morale that was being tested by the cold, the casualties, and the realization that they'd perhaps moved beyond the point where American support could effectively reach them. For soldiers who'd already fought against systemic discrimination and had finally gotten their opportunity to prove themselves as combat soldiers, the possibility that they might be destroyed in this frozen sector of Europe, that the narrative of their defeat might be used to justify the very racism they'd been fighting against, was devastating on a level that went beyond mere military concern. The night of January 10, 1945 was bitterly cold. The thermometer had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the snow had built up in drifts that made movement extraordinarily difficult. German forces surrounding the 761st were settling into positions that they believed would contain the Americans indefinitely. The encirclement was nearly complete. German commanders believed they had at most another day or two before American supply lines would be completely cut and the battalion would be forced to surrender or attempt a desperate breakout that would result in heavy casualties. But what the German commanders underestimated was the exact same quality that had created the Black Panthers' breakthrough in the first place: their determination to succeed in ways that others said were impossible. Colonel Bates called his staff together and made a decision. Instead of waiting for the encirclement to tighten further or attempting a disorganized breakout, he would launch a coordinated attack that would break through the German lines surrounding the battalion through sheer tactical audacity. The plan was risky to the point of seeming suicidal. The 761st would concentrate their remaining tank forces and mechanized infantry in a frontal assault aimed at one specific point in the German encirclement. The attack would be timed for before dawn, when visibility was poorest and German forces were likely to be least alert. It would use every remaining tank that was operational, every soldier who could carry a weapon, in a concentrated effort that would either break through the encirclement or the destruction of what remained of the battalion. The men of the 761st understood the situation with brutal clarity. They were being asked to hold a position that was increasingly difficult to hold against an enemy that had concentrated significant forces against them, with supplies that were running low and morale that was being tested by the cold, the casualties, and the realization that they'd perhaps moved beyond the point where American support could effectively reach them. For soldiers who'd already fought against systemic discrimination and had finally gotten their opportunity to prove themselves as combat soldiers, the possibility that they might be destroyed in this frozen sector of Europe, that the narrative of their defeat might be used to justify the very racism they'd been fighting against, was devastating on a level that went beyond mere military concern. The night of January 10, 1945 was bitterly cold. The thermometer had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the snow had built up in drifts that made movement extraordinarily difficult. German forces surrounding the 761st were settling into positions that they believed would contain the Americans indefinitely. The encirclement was nearly complete. German commanders believed they had at most another day or two before American supply lines would be completely cut and the battalion would be forced to surrender or attempt a desperate breakout that would result in heavy casualties. But what the German commanders underestimated was the exact same quality that had created the Black Panthers' breakthrough in the first place: their determination to succeed in ways that others said were impossible. Colonel Bates called his staff together and made a decision. Instead of waiting for the encirclement to tighten further or attempting a disorganized breakout, he would launch a coordinated attack that would break through the German lines surrounding the battalion through sheer tactical audacity. The plan was risky to the point of seeming suicidal. The 761st would concentrate their remaining tank forces and mechanized infantry in a frontal assault aimed at one specific point in the German encirclement. The attack would be timed for before dawn, when visibility was poorest and German forces were likely to be least alert. It would use every remaining tank that was operational, every soldier who could carry a weapon, in a concentrated effort that would either break through the encirclement or the destruction of what remained of the battalion. The men of the 761st understood what they were being asked to do. They would attack across open terrain in the pre-dawn darkness against German positions that were prepared and defended by concentrated force. The casualty rates would be high, possibly catastrophic. But they would also understand something else. This was their moment. This was where they would demonstrate, not just to themselves, but to history, what they were truly capable of. The attack began at 5:30 a.m. hours, in darkness so complete that men could barely see the forms of the tanks and soldiers around them. Engines roared to life and the 761st moved forward against German positions. The Germans, caught somewhat off guard by the audacity of the attack, initially fell back. German commanders had expected the Americans to either consolidate defensively or attempt a scattered, disorganized breakout. They had not expected a coordinated, concentrated attack against the strongest point of the encirclement. As dawn broke, the full extent of the breakthrough became clear. The 761st had punched through one section of the German encirclement and were now driving forward into territory that was relatively free of German defensive positions. Behind them, German forces were attempting to reorganize and resume the encirclement. But the momentum had shifted. The American breakthrough had provided an escape route not just for the 761st, but for other American units that had been similarly surrounded or isolated. The casualties were indeed heavy. The 761st lost soldiers that night and in the hours immediately following the breakthrough. Tanks were damaged or destroyed. Men that the battalion had trained with, fought alongside, and bonded with through months of combat started to fall in increasing numbers. But the battalion held together, maintained cohesion, and executed the breakout with a level of tactical precision the German commanders found almost incomprehensible. These were men who were supposed to be racially inferior, yet they were executing military maneuvers with a sophistication that rivaled anything German units could do. Word of the breakthrough began to circulate through American forces almost immediately. The 761st's audacious assault, their ability to break an encirclement that German commanders had believed would contain them indefinitely, became something of a legend within the American military. Officers who doubted whether colored soldiers could perform at the highest levels of combat were now faced with evidence that was impossible to deny or downplay. The 7th and 61st had not just survived an encirclement, they'd broken through it through military brilliance and courage. The impact on German morale was equally significant, but worked in the opposite direction. German soldiers who'd believed they had the 761st trapped, who thought they were about to achieve a significant victory by destroying an American colored unit, instead found themselves witnessing that same unit executing a brilliant tactical breakthrough and disappearing into the confusion of the battlefield. The narrative was shifting in real time. The unit that was supposed to be defeated was instead demonstrating superiority in tactics and courage. In Hitler's headquarters, the news of the 761st's breakthrough was received as another blow to an already deteriorating strategic situation. The Germans' attempt to destroy the Black Panthers had failed. More than that, the failure itself was evidence that the racial theories underlying German military planning were fundamentally flawed. The unit that was supposed to be inferior had outmaneuvered, outfought, and outthought the German forces arrayed against them. The 761st breakout from the German encirclement marked a turning point, not just in the tactical situation, but in the broader strategic and psychological dimensions of the war. Within German high command, the realization was becoming unavoidable. The Black Panthers' performance was not an anomaly or the result of equipment advantage. It was the result of superior soldiers commanding superior tactics, and they were proving it again and again on the battlefield. Colonel Bates continued to push the 761st forward, sensing that the momentum had shifted decisively in the Americans' favor. The battalion had now achieved something that no colored unit was supposed to achieve. According to Nazi racial theory, they had broken through prepared German defensive positions, advanced deep into German-held territory, survived an encirclement, and maintained their combat effectiveness while doing so. They had done all of this while facing an enemy that had been led to believe they were fighting racially inferior soldiers. The propaganda ministry in Berlin faced an increasingly impossible situation. They could not celebrate the German commander's attempts to destroy the 761st because those attempts had failed. They could not acknowledge the 761st's success because doing so would validate American racial integration of combat units and contradict fundamental Nazi ideology. The solution was continued strategic silence, treating the Black Panthers' achievements as if they were either not happening or irrelevant to the larger strategic situation. But within the military establishment, particularly among younger officers, the implications were being discussed with increasing frankness. If the racial theories about the 761st's capabilities were wrong, what other aspects of racial science that had been used to justify military planning were also wrong? If a unit of men who were supposed to be racially inferior was outperforming German units, then the entire theoretical foundation for German military racism was demonstrably false. General Hunter von Manteuffel, still commanding in the sector where the 761st was operating, found himself in the position of having to file reports that documented the Black Panther success. As a professional soldier, he had to report the military situation accurately, even when that situation contradicted the ideological framework he was supposedly operating within. His reports noted the 761st's tactical innovations, their ability to maintain combat effectiveness under difficult conditions, and their capacity to execute complex military maneuvers under pressure. These reports, circulating through the German military hierarchy, were creating a kind of cognitive dissonance among German officers. They could read about the 761st's performance in official military documents, could see the evidence of their effectiveness in captured German defensive positions, could talk to soldiers who'd faced the Black Panthers in combat. All of this evidence pointed toward a single inescapable conclusion. The racial theories underlying German military planning were fraudulent. The American military, meanwhile, was beginning to grapple with different implications from the 761st's success. The battalion's performance was providing evidence that could be used to challenge racial segregation in American military institutions. If colored soldiers could fight at this level when given the opportunity, if they could break through prepared German defensive positions and survive encirclements, if they could execute sophisticated tactical maneuvers under the most difficult conditions, then the arguments for segregating the military were being systematically dismantled in real time. The 761st's success had become something larger than just military achievement. It had become evidence in a larger argument about human capability, about the relationship between race and military competence, about the nature of courage and excellence under pressure. Every tank that broke through German lines, every soldier who survived and continued fighting, every tactical maneuver executed with precision was testimony to something that extended beyond the immediate military situation. Colonel Bates, commanding the battalion through the final stages of the campaign, understood on some level that his men were fighting for something larger than military victory. But his immediate focus remained on the tactical situation, pushing the 761st forward, maintaining their combat effectiveness, ensuring that as many of his soldiers as possible survived the war and returned home to bear witness to what they had accomplished. As January turned to February 1945, the German military situation began its final deterioration. The Ardennes Offensive, the last major German attempt to turn the war around, had failed. The Wehrmacht's reserves had been exhausted, and American forces were beginning to consolidate and prepare for the final offensive into Germany itself. The 761st Tank Battalion, now fully integrated into the American advance, found itself not on the desperate defense they'd experienced weeks earlier, but rather pushing deeper into German territory as part of the closing phase of the European campaign. The psychological dimensions of the war had shifted. German soldiers were increasingly demoralized, understanding that the military situation was becoming hopeless. German civilians, bombarded by evidence of the regime's failures and facing the reality of Russian advances from the east and American advances from the west, were beginning to comprehend that the end was approaching. And throughout it all, the 761st continued to advance, continued to break through German defensive positions, continued to demonstrate military excellence. The battalion's casualties had been significant by this point in the campaign. The men who'd broken through the Siegfried Line weeks earlier had been joined by replacements, but the core group of experienced soldiers had been diminished by losses. Sergeant Warren Cressy and others like him had lost friends, had seen good soldiers killed in action, had experienced the trauma of continuous combat, but they had also experienced something that no amount of discrimination or racism could take away. They had proven themselves as combat soldiers at the highest level. German commanders in their remaining battle orders and situation reports continued to treat the 761st with an unusual level of attention. In some cases, German units that encountered the Black Panthers tanks reported feeling an immediate sense of disadvantage, as if they were facing not just another American unit, but something that had become legendary in its competence and aggression. The psychological impact of the 761st's reputation was becoming as significant as their actual military capabilities. The regiment's battles during this phase of the campaign took them through German towns and villages, past scenes of industrial destruction from previous bombing campaigns, through landscapes that were increasingly showing signs of military defeat. They saw the infrastructure of Nazi Germany crumbling, saw evidence of the regime's atrocities in concentration camps and other locations, witnessed the human cost of years of warfare and totalitarian rule. For the men of the 761st, these sights reinforced the righteousness of their fight. They had been fighting against a regime that had constructed an entire ideological system on racial hatred, that had used that ideology to justify unspeakable crimes. Now, as they advanced through German territory, they were seeing direct evidence of where those ideologies led, to destruction, death, and the comprehensive collapse of a nation that had built itself on fraudulent racial theories. Colonel Bates maintained the 761st's focus on military objectives. Even as the campaign entered its final phases, the battalion continued to execute tactical maneuvers with precision, continued to push forward, continued to maintain the standards of military excellence that had characterized their entire campaign. By this point in the war, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was only how quickly the campaign would reach its conclusion and how many more soldiers would be lost before the fighting ended. The Germans, recognizing the inevitability of their military defeat, began to surrender in increasing numbers. Some units attempted to fight to the last. Others recognized the futility of continued resistance. The 761st, witnessing German soldiers who just weeks earlier had been fighting with desperation, now laying down their weapons and accepting capture, had the unique experience of watching an enemy give up that had been told by their own military leadership that they were fighting racially inferior opponents. The European campaign ended in May 1945 with German military unconditional surrender. The 761st Tank Battalion, which had begun the campaign fighting against prejudice from within their own military establishment while simultaneously engaging German forces, emerged from the war with achievements that could not be denied or minimized. They had broken through the Siegfried Line, had survived German encirclement, had pushed deeper into German territory than most other American units, and had demonstrated military excellence at every stage of their combat operations. For Colonel Paul L. Bates and his men, the immediate celebration of victory was tempered by the recognition that their fight was far from over. They had proven themselves as combat soldiers, had demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every racist theory that had been used to justify segregation and discrimination. But returning to an America that was still legally segregated, that was still structured around racial hierarchies, meant that the battles they'd won on European battlefields had not automatically translated into social or political changes at home. The impact of the 761st's achievements, however, could not be fully contained. Military historians began to document the battalion's success. Officers who'd served with the regiment became advocates for racial integration in the military, having witnessed firsthand that colored soldiers were not just capable of excellent military performance, but were capable of outperforming white units in some tactical situations. The evidence was undeniable. It was embedded in captured German positions, in military reports, in the testimony of soldiers who'd fought alongside the Black Panthers. In German military circles, the implications were even more profound. German officers who'd survived the war began to privately acknowledge that their racial theories had been fundamentally wrong, that they'd based military planning on pseudoscience and ideology rather than on reality. The 761st's performance had provided evidence that the entire edifice of Nazi racial science was fraudulent, not in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of military operations. The significance of the 761st's breakthrough through Hitler's defenses went far beyond the immediate military impact of breaking a defensive line or advancing territory. It was the concrete demonstration that racial hierarchies were false, that the ideologies claiming some groups were naturally inferior to others were contradicted by lived military experience. When Hitler learned that the Black Panthers Tank Battalion had crashed through his defenses, when he understood that colored soldiers were doing things that his racial ideology said should be impossible, he was confronted with evidence that everything he'd built his regime on was wrong. Sergeant Warren Ceci, the tank driver who'd become legendary for his ability to navigate impossible terrain, lived through the entire war and survived to come home to an America that was still segregated. But he had participated in something historically significant. He had been part of a unit that had challenged the fundamental racist underpinnings of both his own military establishment and of Nazi Germany. That significance could never be fully erased, even by the prejudice and discrimination that continued to greet him after the war. The 761st story became part of the larger narrative of how the Second World War began to transform American racial politics. Their demonstrated excellence in combat became evidence that was used in the arguments for military integration in the post-war period. The mere fact of their success, their breakthrough through German defensive lines, their survival of encirclement, their tactical innovations, all of this became historical testimony that contradicted the racial hierarchies that had defined American military organization. The transformative power of what the 761sts accomplished lay not just in the immediate military impact of their tactical breakthrough, but in what that breakthrough represented: concrete, undeniable evidence that the theories claiming racial superiority were false. Every German defensive position they broke through, every tactical maneuver they executed with precision, every casualty they inflicted on an enemy that had been taught they were fighting racially inferior opponents, all of this was testimony to something larger than military victory. When the 761st Tank Battalion crashed through Hitler's defenses that winter of 1944-1945, they did something that no amount of propaganda or ideology could fully contain. They demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that excellence knows no color, that courage cannot be determined by race, and that the theories on which entire systems of oppression were built could be dismantled by the simple fact of superior performance by those whom the ideology claimed should be inferior. The legacy of that breakthrough extended far beyond the European theater of World War II. It became part of the foundation for the arguments that would eventually lead to military integration in 1948, for the civil rights movements that would challenge segregation in the decades following the war, and for the slow, painful process through which America began to confront the fundamental falseness of its racial ideologies. The Black Panthers Tank Battalion's achievement was military, yes, but it was also historical, ideological, and transformative in ways that extended well beyond the immediate battlefield. Would you like me to adjust the story's tone, add more dramatic tension in specific sections, or refocus any particular chapters?